Staff Sergeant David Chen led his 5-man team up the treacherous slopes of the Hindu Kush mountains in eastern Afghanistan. The helicopter had dropped them at dawn, its rotors beating a hasty retreat as soon as the last boot touched the rocky ground. Chen's squad consisted of experienced soldiers: Corporal Martinez, a sniper whose steady hands had saved lives in 2 previous deployments; Specialist Williams, barely 23 but with an uncanny ability to make radio equipment work in impossible conditions; Private Jackson, their medic, whose nervous energy masked deep competence in trauma care; and Private First Class Thompson, an engineer who could read rock formations like blueprints. Their mission seemed routine enough: establish an observation post to monitor Taliban supply routes through the extensive cave systems that honeycombed the mountainside. Intelligence reports suggested these ancient passages were being used to move weapons and fighters between Pakistan and the Afghan interior. What the briefing hadn't mentioned was the weight of history that pressed down on these peaks, or the fact that every major military force to occupy this region had filed similar reports about unexplained incidents in the caves. The village of Kamdesh clung to the lower slopes like a collection of mud brick tumors, its buildings seeming to grow organically from the mountain itself. When Chen's team had passed through during their ascent, the reception had been distinctly cold. The villagers watched with eyes that held knowledge they clearly didn't want to share. The village elder, a weathered man whose face bore the lines of 70 harsh winters, spoke through their Pashtun interpreter Rashid with obvious reluctance. "The Div have always lived in the deep places," he said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "They were here before the Prophet, peace be upon him, before the British Redcoats, before Alexander's bronze-speared warriors. The Russians learned this truth in the 1980s, just as you will learn it now." Rashid translated with increasing nervousness, adding his own family's warnings. "Sir, my grandfather fought alongside the Mujahideen against the Soviet occupation. He told stories of entire Soviet patrols found dead in the caves with no wounds. No signs of struggle, just empty, like something had hollowed them out from within." Chen filed these warnings under local superstition, but the terror in both men's eyes suggested belief deeper than folklore. Their first reconnaissance of the primary cave system yielded discoveries that transformed routine military procedure into something approaching archaeological nightmare. Thompson's flashlight beam illuminated scattered Soviet equipment throughout the main cavern. AK-47 rifles twisted into impossible metal sculptures, helmets crushed as if by tremendous pressure, applied from multiple angles simultaneously, and personal effects that painted a picture of panic and sudden abandonment. The condition of the metal was what disturbed Thompson most. "Staff Sergeant," he called, his voice echoing strangely in the cavern's unusual acoustics. "This isn't battle damage. Look at how the steel is deformed. It's been shaped, molded like clay while still retaining its metallurgical properties. What kind of force accomplishes that without generating enough heat to melt the surrounding rock?" Martinez examined the scene with a sniper's attention to detail, noting scratch marks gouged deep into the cave walls in patterns that hurt to examine directly. The marks were too large and too regularly spaced to be natural, forming geometric arrangements that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed through peripheral vision. Jackson's medical training helped him identify the dark stains soaked into the porous limestone floor as human blood, but blood that had settled into patterns suggesting struggle against something that attacked from impossible angles. The spatter patterns indicated arterial wounds, but wounds inflicted by something that had been above, below, and somehow inside the victim simultaneously. Williams attempted to establish communication with their base camp, but his sophisticated radio equipment produced only static, punctuated by sounds that resembled rhythmic breathing, deep, patient inhalations that seemed to emerge from within the mountain itself, rather than from any external source. The breathing had a quality that made all 5 soldiers unconsciously synchronize their own respiratory patterns before they realized what was happening and forced themselves to break the rhythm. As they explored deeper, the temperature dropped noticeably despite the lack of air circulation that should have caused such cooling, and their flashlight beams seemed to be absorbed by the darkness ahead rather than illuminating it, as if light itself was being consumed by whatever waited in the depths. As night settled over the Hindu Kush and the team established their defensive perimeter, The mountain began to produce sounds that challenged everything they understood about cave acoustics and geological stability. What started as barely perceptible vibration felt more than heard gradually intensified into a resonance that seemed to emanate from vast spaces deep within the earth. Thompson, whose engineering background made him sensitive to structural acoustics, pressed his ear against the cave wall and jerked back as if stung. "There's something massive behind this rock face," he reported, rubbing his ear where the stone had left it tingling with alien sensation. Empty spaces that extend far beyond what any geological survey would predict for this mountain. And the sound isn't wind or settling rock. It has rhythm, pattern, almost like... He paused, reluctant to voice what his technical mind was telling him, almost like breathing. But breathing on a scale that would require lungs the size of aircraft hangars. Martinez maintained overwatch from the cave entrance, his sniper scope revealing movement in the darkness that didn't correspond to any wildlife known to inhabit these altitudes. Through infrared imaging, he tracked heat signatures that appeared roughly human-sized, but moved with fluid grace across vertical rock faces, defying gravity with casual indifference to physical law. As Chen established final watch rotations and checked their defensive positions, he found himself questioning every assumption his military training had instilled about enemy capabilities and threat assessment. The cave system they now occupied felt less like a shelter than like the throat of some vast, sleeping entity. And as the strange breathing from within the mountain grew stronger and more rhythmic, Chen realized that their mission parameters had fundamentally changed from intelligence gathering to simple survival. Dawn in the Hindu Kush brought no relief from the previous night's mounting dread, only harsh illumination that revealed their fears as pale shadows of a deeper reality, stalking them through the mountain's stone arteries. Sergeant Brooks had led his four-man patrol into the lower cave network at 0500 hours, following thermal signatures that suggested possible equipment caches or supply routes used by Taliban forces. Their radio communications had been routine for the first 3 hours, with Brooks reporting standard reconnaissance findings and requesting permission to investigate some unusual rock formations that didn't match their geological surveys. At 0847 hours, Brooks transmitted his final coherent message. "Control, we found something down here. The formations. They're not natural. Perfectly carved chambers with tool marks that don't match any known construction technique. And there are sounds, organic sounds, like breathing through solid stone." Williams had attempted to re-establish contact every 15 minutes, according to standard operating procedure, but received only static that seemed to carry undertones of human speech played at wrong frequencies. After 6 hours of radio silence, Chen made the decision that every combat leader dreads launching a search and rescue operation into terrain where the enemy's capabilities remained completely unknown. The search party's descent into the cave network revealed a labyrinth that their topographical maps suggested should be simple limestone caverns, but which Thompson's preliminary measurements indicated extended far deeper than any natural geological process could account for. The passages twisted and branched in patterns that hurt to follow visually, creating a three-dimensional maze that seemed designed to disorient human perception and navigation instincts. As they penetrated deeper into the system, the air grew thick with a metallic scent that Jackson identified as similar to old blood mixed with something mineral and alien. Their flashlight beams, which had seemed adequate for normal cave exploration, appeared increasingly feeble against darkness that seemed to possess physical substance, absorbing light rather than reflecting it back to their eyes. The silence was wrong as well, not the natural quiet of underground spaces, but an active suppression of sound that made their own breathing seem unnaturally loud and their footsteps echo from directions that didn't match their actual positions. Thompson's engineering instruments began providing readings that contradicted both visual observation and physical law, showing distances that changed depending on the angle of measurement and structural load calculations that suggested the cave system should have collapsed under its own weight millennia ago. The first evidence of Brooks's missing patrol appeared scattered across a cavern that their flashlight beams revealed to be impossibly vast, its ceiling lost in darkness that seemed to swallow their illumination completely. Personal equipment lay strewn in patterns that spoke of panic rather than organized combat. Weapons abandoned mid-reload with ammunition scattered in wide arcs, backpacks torn open with contents flung across the cavern floor, and most disturbingly, personal items arranged in geometric configurations that made the eye hurt to contemplate directly. Martinez discovered that several pieces of equipment had been placed in positions that were geometrically impossible given the cavern's layout, suggesting that either the chamber's dimensions were not what they appeared, or that something had moved the items through space in ways that violated basic physics. Thompson found scratch marks carved deep into the cavern walls, but these weren't random gouges of desperation or panic. They formed deliberate patterns, symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed through peripheral vision, hieroglyphs of terror inscribed by something with claws designed specifically for carving stone. The scratches penetrated several inches into solid limestone, requiring either tools of incredible hardness or strength that no human could possess. Jackson's medical expertise helped him track blood spatter patterns that began as recognizable human arterial spray, but gradually transformed into something that challenged everything he'd learned about trauma medicine and physics. The blood trails started conventionally enough, showing evidence of significant wounds and movement patterns consistent with injured personnel attempting to find exit routes. However, as he followed the crimson traces deeper into the cavern, the patterns began defying gravitational expectations. Droplets that should have fallen downward instead traced paths upward along the walls, creating spiraling designs that led toward ceiling cracks their flashlights couldn't penetrate. Some blood trails simply ended at what appeared to be solid rock faces, as if the wounded had walked directly through stone barriers or been absorbed by the mountain itself. Martinez, scanning the cavern through his rifle scope and thermal imaging equipment, confirmed that several blood trails terminated at positions where his instruments detected neither heat signatures nor any physical evidence of passage. The implications were disturbing enough that none of the search party voiced them aloud. Their missing comrades had somehow moved through solid matter, or something had moved them in ways that human understanding couldn't accommodate. The helmet-mounted cameras recovered from Brooks's scattered equipment told a story that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality's nature and consistency. Williams connected the first camera to his portable monitor, and the squad gathered in grim silence to witness their comrades' final moments rendered in grainy night vision imagery. The footage showed the patrol moving through narrow passages that seemed to pulse with organic rhythm, walls that breathed and expanded like living tissue, floors that rippled underfoot like water, despite being solid stone. Brooks' voice provided narration for their descent into madness. The formations down here are definitely artificial. Perfectly smooth surfaces, architectural precision that would challenge modern construction techniques. But who built this and when? And why does everything feel alive? The camera work grew increasingly erratic as whatever stalked them closed in, recording movements in peripheral darkness that the human eye couldn't properly process. Shapes flowed rather than walked, forms that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially in mathematical dimensions that three-dimensional vision couldn't accommodate. The final minutes devolved into chaos as something struck from multiple directions simultaneously, the camera spinning wildly while recording screams that no human throat should be able to produce. Most disturbing were the voices captured in those final moments, Brooks and his men speaking fluently in languages that Williams's linguistic database couldn't identify. Their familiar tones rendered alien by words that seemed to bypass conscious understanding and speak directly to evolutionary terror centers in the brain. Thompson's engineering curiosity compelled the team deeper into cave systems that challenged not only tactical assumptions, but fundamental laws governing structural mechanics and spatial geometry. His measurement instruments indicated chambers that exceeded the load-bearing capacity of limestone formations by several orders of magnitude, spaces carved with mathematical precision that suggested tools and techniques far beyond current human capability. The walls curved in relationships that his engineering education insisted were physically impossible. Angles that seemed to fold three-dimensional space back upon itself in configurations that made his eyes water when examined directly. "Staff Sergeant," he reported, professional confusion evident in his voice, "the acoustic properties in these chambers violate everything I know about sound propagation. Echoes arrive before the original sounds that created them, and my laser measurements show distances that don't correspond to visual observation. It's as if the normal rules of physics have different parameters down here. Martinez recognized the tactical implications immediately. These formations provided natural fortifications that commanded fields of fire in directions that conventional military doctrine insisted didn't exist. Defensive positions that covered approaches from angles that existed only in theoretical mathematics textbooks. Williams discovered that electromagnetic radiation behaved abnormally in these spaces, his radio equipment receiving signals that arrived at his antenna before they were transmitted from their source, and detecting communications from coordinates that his GPS unit insisted were solid rock. The carved surfaces throughout the chamber complex told visual stories in artistic languages that predated human civilization, yet somehow conveyed meaning that bypassed conscious interpretation and communicated directly with instinctual knowledge buried in evolutionary memory. Jackson's medical training helped him recognize anatomical diagrams scattered throughout the decorative patterns, but these depicted physiology for creatures that had never followed terrestrial evolutionary development. The skeletal structures incorporated joint arrangements that would allow movement through solid matter, musculature that suggested locomotion across surfaces that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and nervous systems that appeared to extend beyond individual organisms into collective consciousness networks spanning geological time periods. Thompson identified engineering schematics hidden within the seemingly decorative motifs, blueprints for construction projects that violated conservation of energy and mass, architectural plans showing buildings that existed in multiple spatial locations simultaneously, and technical specifications for tools that manipulated space-time geometry as easily as human implements shaped wood or metal. Martinez spotted tactical diagrams depicting warfare techniques that utilized gravitational fields as weapons, battlefield strategies that assumed combatants could move through solid matter like water, and logistics systems that drew resources from parallel dimensions adjacent to normal reality. Their interpreter Rashid's increasingly terrified refusal to translate large sections of the carved text provided clear evidence that these inscriptions contained knowledge too dangerous for human consciousness to process safely. When Chen ordered him to attempt translation, despite his obvious reluctance, Rashid began sweating profusely, despite the chamber's chill, and explained that some symbols resembled scripts mentioned in pre-Islamic manuscripts, languages supposedly spoken by jinn and other entities that existed parallel to human reality, but operated according to different natural laws. "These words," he whispered, backing away from the wall carvings, "they are not meant for human tongues to shape or human ears to hear. My grandfather's grandfather told stories of similar markings found in caves near the ancient Buddhist sites at Bamiyan. Scholars who attempted translation were found days later, still alive but no longer themselves. The meanings change the reader, make them perceive things that human minds were never designed to witness." Williams's sophisticated linguistic analysis software crashed repeatedly when attempting to process digital photographs of the text, his computer screens displaying error messages in alphabets that didn't exist in any linguistic database, followed by system failures that left his equipment displaying coordinates for locations that existed in mathematical spaces adjacent to normal three-dimensional reality. The deeper chamber complexes revealed evidence of continuous habitation spanning geological epochs rather than mere historical periods, occupation by intelligences that measured time in terms that made human civilization appear as brief as individual heartbeats. Jackson discovered fire pits showing signs of use for thousands of years, hash deposits containing organic residue from creatures that shouldn't have existed in these mountains, according to any known paleontological record, and cooking implements designed for food preparation techniques that his survival training couldn't begin to classify. The tools were crafted from materials his field testing kit couldn't identify, substances that appeared metallic but bent like organic tissue, cutting edges that remained impossibly sharp despite obvious age, and handles shaped for grips that would require hands with more fingers than human anatomy provided. Thompson found construction evidence that challenged everything his engineering education had taught him about materials science and architectural possibility. Tool marks in the stone surfaces showed no trace of the implements that created them. Joints between massive stone blocks so precise that microscopic examination would be required to locate seams, and construction techniques that appeared to involve reshaping solid granite, like modeling clay through methods that required either impossible heat generation or manipulation of atomic structure through unknown principles. Martinez identified what appeared to be weapons storage areas throughout the complex, but weapons designed for combat against enemies that moved in non-linear patterns through space-time and could exist in multiple locations simultaneously. The weapon mounts were sized for implements far larger than human hands could manage, with trajectory calculation charts that plotted projectile paths through spatial dimensions that didn't correspond to normal three-dimensional combat environments. Ammunition storage showed evidence of projectiles designed to affect targets that existed partially in parallel realities, warheads that could track enemies through solid matter, and delivery systems that ignored conventional ballistic physics entirely. Williams' communication equipment began detecting transmissions that originated from within the very chamber where the team stood. Radio signals broadcast from positions that their eyes confirmed contained only empty space. The intercepted communications used perfect modern military terminology and communication protocols, but described tactical situations that violated every known law of physics. Unit positions were reported using coordinate systems that included dimensions beyond the standard 3. Supply requirements included materials that couldn't exist according to chemistry textbooks, and enemy contact reports described hostile forces that attacked from mathematical spaces between normal reality's structural foundations. Most disturbing was the gradual recognition that these transmissions were coming from Brooks's missing patrol, still alive but operating in spatial dimensions that human perception couldn't access, fighting a war in realms that existed in the gaps between what mathematics could describe and what human consciousness could survive experiencing directly. The supply drop operation transformed from routine logistics into geometrical nightmare when Thompson became separated from his team during what began as a minor rockfall but escalated into a seismic event that challenged fundamental assumptions about cave stability and the behavior of solid matter under stress. The initial rumbling seemed normal enough. Mountain caves were subject to settling and small shifts as temperature changes affected rock expansion. However, Thompson's engineering background immediately recognized that the sounds emerging from deep within the mountain followed organic rhythms rather than geological patterns, as if the stone itself was breathing with the slow, patient respiration of something vast beyond human comprehension. Within seconds, passages that had been clear during their entry began filling with debris, but debris that moved with deliberate purpose rather than following gravity's predictable downward pull. Rocks flowed upward and sideways, sealing specific exit routes while leaving others temporarily open, creating a maze that bore no resemblance to the carefully mapped cave system they had entered just hours earlier. Thompson's panicked radio transmissions crackled through static that Williams identified as similar to recorded brainwave patterns. The walls are repositioning themselves, not collapsing, repositioning. Passages are opening where solid rock existed seconds ago and closing behind me as I move through them. His voice carried the strain of someone whose technical training was being systematically demolished by direct observation of impossibilities. Thompson's increasingly desperate radio reports painted a picture of pursuit through chambers that transformed themselves to facilitate whatever was hunting him through architectural spaces that violated engineering principles. Something's following me through passages that should be too narrow for anything larger than a cave rat. His transmission cut through interference that sounded like whispered conversations in unknown languages. But it's not using the passages the way we do. It's moving through the rock itself like the stone was water. Williams tracked Thompson's signal through cave systems that his equipment insisted extended far deeper into the mountain than any geological survey had ever indicated possible. Radio waves bouncing off surfaces that seemed to exist in spaces between normal dimensional boundaries. Thompson's engineering mind continued cataloging structural impossibilities, even as primal terror began affecting his voice modulation and breathing patterns. The construction techniques down here are beyond anything in human architectural history. Spaces designed for movement in directions that don't exist in normal geometry. Rooms with more interior volume than exterior space should allow. And the walls. Christ, the walls are watching me move. Martinez attempted to track their missing engineer through thermal imaging equipment, but his instruments showed readings that suggested Thompson was somehow occupying multiple positions simultaneously. His heat signature scattered across a three-dimensional space in patterns that should have indicated death and dismemberment, but corresponded with his continued radio communications. The team's pursuit through passages that reconfigured themselves with each step brought them into chambers that challenged not only tactical training but basic assumptions about the nature of space and time within Earth's geological structures. Jackson's medical background helped him recognize anatomical modifications depicted in stone reliefs that covered every available surface, surgical procedures carved with impossible detail that showed systematic transformation of human physiology into forms capable of existing in mathematical spaces between conventional dimensions. The operations depicted were performed with precision that exceeded current medical technology, using instruments that could manipulate living tissue at the molecular level and achieving results that would allow human consciousness to survive in environments where normal physics would instantly kill unmodified organisms. Thompson's scattered equipment, found throughout chambers that couldn't exist according to structural engineering principles, included measurement devices that had been modified by something with complete understanding of their internal mechanisms. His laser distance measuring tools had been recalibrated for dimensions that folded back upon themselves. His structural analysis computer had been reprogrammed to calculate load-bearing requirements for buildings that existed in multiple realities simultaneously, and his construction planning software had been loaded with architectural templates for projects that spanned geological epochs and required materials that could only be obtained from parallel dimensional sources. Williams discovered that communication functioned perfectly in these impossible chambers, but functioned according to rules that no telecommunications textbook had ever described. His transmissions arrived at their destinations before he spoke them, allowing him to have conversations with future versions of himself who had already experienced events that his present self was approaching. Radio signals from Thompson's position described tactical situations that changed retroactively based on decisions the search team hadn't yet made. Combat reports that included casualties from weapon systems that hadn't been deployed, and supply requests for equipment that wouldn't be invented for decades. Martinez identified defensive positions carved into walls that hurt to examine directly, fighting positions designed for warfare against enemies that attacked from directions that existed only in theoretical physics equations, and tactical advantages that could only be utilized by combatants who could perceive and move through mathematical dimensions adjacent to normal space-time. The stone fortifications showed evidence of use by creatures that understood advanced physics intuitively, beings that had been perfecting military techniques in spaces between realities for periods that measured time in geological epochs rather than human lifespans. They found Thompson in a chamber that human perception couldn't properly process, a space where walls curved through angles that three-dimensional vision couldn't follow, and floors extended in directions that didn't correspond to any known spatial orientation. He sat pressed against what appeared to be solid stone, but which their instruments detected as empty space, his eyes tracking movement that their vision couldn't see, his hands sketching geometric patterns in the air, as if drawing blueprints for constructions that existed in dimensions beyond normal architectural possibility. "They showed me the building techniques," he whispered as Jackson administered sedatives that seemed to have no effect on whatever psychological trauma had reorganized his neural patterns. "They're not constructing in our space-time continuum. They build in the mathematical gaps between reality's foundation, in the spaces where physics breaks down, and different natural laws take precedence. And they've been refining these techniques for thousands of years, using human consciousness as raw material, incorporating our thought patterns as structural elements in constructions that span multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously." His Technical descriptions included engineering specifications that his conscious education couldn't have conceived, architectural concepts that utilized principles unknown to human science, and construction methodologies that treated space and time as malleable resources rather than fixed constraints limiting building possibilities. Chen's decision to abandon the mission evolved, not from tactical analysis, but from fundamental recognition that his team faced adversaries whose capabilities transcended every category of conventional threat assessment. That military doctrine had developed over centuries of human warfare. The entities inhabiting the cave system had demonstrated abilities that rendered standard combat training not merely inadequate, but actively counterproductive. Movement through solid matter as easily as through air. Manipulation of space-time geometry to create tactical advantages that shouldn't exist. And most disturbing, the capacity to exist simultaneously in normal three-dimensional space and in mathematical dimensions that human perception couldn't access, but which apparently provided strategic positions for observing and affecting events in conventional reality. Williams managed to establish brief communication with Command through channels that his equipment shouldn't have been able to access. His emergency extraction request traveling through transmission methods that bypassed normal electromagnetic propagation entirely. The response arrived faster than signal travel time should have allowed, suggesting that Command maintained communication capabilities they hadn't disclosed during mission briefing. Extraction authorized immediately. Geological instability reported in your operational sector. Chen understood the military euphemism perfectly. Command had dealt with similar incidents before, and official policy involved immediate evacuation, followed by systematic denial, rather than investigation or engagement. Thompson's fragmented revelations, delivered through medication-resistant babbling that Jackson recorded with equipment that subsequently malfunctioned when reviewed, painted a comprehensive picture of the cave system's actual purpose that recontextualized every assumption about human military history in the Hindu Kush region. "They're not just living in the caves," Thompson mumbled, his engineering expertise processing architectural data that no human education should have provided. "They're building something vast, a construction project that's been ongoing for thousands of years. Every army that enters these mountains becomes part of the building process, not casualties of war, but raw materials for construction in mathematical spaces where our physics don't apply." His descriptions included detailed specifications for buildings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, engineering projects that utilized human consciousness as structural components in the same way. Conventional construction used steel and concrete, and timelines that measured progress in geological epochs rather than human lifespans. The construction project, according to Thompson's impossible knowledge, had incorporated military units from Alexander the Great's army, British colonial forces, Soviet occupation troops, and now potentially American Special Operations personnel, each contributing specific expertise that the builders required for different phases of their interdimensional architecture. Williams's final communication intercepts revealed the scope and horror of what they had encountered in its full magnitude. Radio transmissions from Brooks's missing patrol that confirmed the worst possible interpretation of their situation. The missing soldiers hadn't been killed. They had been transformed, their consciousness incorporated into whatever vast construction project the entities had been pursuing across geological time periods. "Brooks here," came transmissions from positions deep within the mountain that no human could have survived reaching, his voice immediately recognizable, but reporting tactical information that described combat operations in spaces that existed parallel to normal reality. "We're maintaining defensive positions in sectors that don't appear on standard topographical maps, engaging hostile forces that utilize weapon systems based on physics principles not yet discovered by human science. Our current operational parameters include combat in mathematical spaces between normal coordinates, and supply requirements now include resources that can't be manufactured using terrestrial technology." Martinez traced these transmissions to coordinates that led deeper into the mountain than their maps indicated was possible, signals originating from positions that existed in mathematical spaces. His equipment could detect, but his perception couldn't access directly. The final confrontation demonstrated the entity's complete tactical superiority and their patient intelligence that operated according to strategic thinking spanning millennia rather than individual human lifetimes. They emerged from solid rock faces simultaneously, descended through ceiling spaces that thermal imaging confirmed were solid stone, and attacked from directions that existed only in mathematical dimensions, adjacent to normal three-dimensional space. Martinez attempted to establish fields of fire using standard infantry tactics, but found that his targets moved through spaces between his projectile trajectories, existing in mathematical positions that weapons designed for conventional three-dimensional warfare couldn't address effectively. Jackson administered combat stimulants and medical countermeasures that had no effect whatsoever on psychological influences the entities projected, his patients remaining conscious and responsive, but taking orders from command sources that his medical training couldn't identify or counter. Chen ordered fighting withdrawal through passages that the entities reconfigured in real time to provide themselves with overwhelming tactical advantages, escape routes that led deeper into cave systems rather than towards surface extraction points, architectural modifications that demonstrated complete understanding of human military doctrine combined with capabilities that rendered such doctrine obsolete. The helicopter extraction succeeded only because the entities chose to permit it, their intelligence calculating that allowing isolated survivors to escape would serve their long-term construction project better than total elimination of human witnesses to their activities. As the aircraft lifted away from the mountainside extraction point, Chen observed through enhanced night vision equipment the true scope of what they had encountered. Dozens of entities emerging simultaneously from cave openings across the entire mountain range, their forms barely distinguishable from natural rock formations until they chose to reveal their presence through deliberate movement. The Hindu Kush mountains stretched endlessly below them, ancient peaks that contained construction projects spanning geological ages, engineering marvels that had been incorporating human military expertise as building materials in mathematical spaces adjacent to normal reality since before human civilization developed written language. The official incident report classified their losses as combat casualties, resulting from cave-ins and Taliban insurgent activity, bureaucratic language that transformed impossible truth into manageable fiction suitable for military filing systems. But Chen knew the actual facts, and these mountains had been claimed by intelligences that measured time in geological epochs and viewed human history as merely the latest source of construction materials for projects that existed in spaces. Between the mathematical foundations of reality itself, builders who had been perfecting their techniques since before human ancestors learned to make fire, and who would continue their work long after human civilization became another geological layer in Earth's archaeological record.